You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's 9:30am on a Monday morning in April 2002, and Emma and her brother-in-law Damien are turning the spare key in her mother's two-storey townhouse in one of Melbourne's wealthiest suburbs. They tried to call the night before, but no answer, and now the whole family is worried. As they're fiddling with the door, a taxi pulls up. "Who are you looking for?" Emma asks. "Paul King," replies the driver. "He's going to the Girraween Daycare Centre." Emma looks at Damien terrified and bursts into tears. Her mum would never forget to cancel a taxi. They quickly enter the house and do a runaround. There's some wine glasses in the sink. The bedside lamp is on, and the bed is turned down, ready for someone to hop in after a night out and about. The answering machine is blinking red, full of messages from the last few days. But 69-year-old Margaret Wales-King and her 75-year-old husband Paul are nowhere to be found. As police descend on number 40 Mercer Road in Armidale and start looking for clues, one thing is obvious: there are no signs of violence. Her kids quickly discern that something's not right though, and they figure out that Thursday seems to be the last anyone heard from the couple. By evening, most of the Wales siblings are gathered in their mother's front room. Matthew, the youngest, is the most upset, wailing and making quite a scene. He is, after all, the last to have seen them. "Where's my mama?" he asks them all. "What's happened to my mama?" His reaction is strange, but his behaviour will become more and more odd as the investigation into Margaret and Paul's disappearance ramps up. It'll be a case that will fascinate the country, a rich, privileged Australian family that isn't as it seems, and a story that proves money and jealousy can make someone turn on anyone, even their own mother. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about the Wales-King murders that happened in Melbourne in the early 2000s. Joining me to discuss the case is Melbourne barrister Hilary Bonney and former homicide detective Charlie Bezzina. Hilary is the author of the acclaimed book The Society Murders, which has also been adapted for television, while Charlie was one of Victoria's top detectives. In his 17 years in the homicide squad, he investigated more than 300 suspicious deaths, including 150 murders. Among them, the Wales-King Society murders. Hilary, who was Margaret Mary Wales-King?
She was a mother of 5 children. She was a wealthy woman who lived in Armidale. She was the daughter of Robert Lord, who made a lot of money out of road construction and suburb constructions in Melbourne. She was a privileged woman. She had a luxury life. She had properties down in the peninsula. She had a unit up in the snow. And her life was dictated by the usual seasons of the upper class in Melbourne. So summers in the peninsula, winters in the snow. And meanwhile, she played bridge, visited friends, and had a lovely sort of luxury life.
So she was well known in those kind of Melbourne socialite communities or circles.
Yes, she was. And she was born and bred in that milieu, and her sister also was equivalent to her in Sydney.
Can you talk us through her family? Because she had a bunch of kids and a lot of grandkids as well.
She did. She had 5 children, and Matthew was her youngest. She had a son called Damien who lived in Sydney. He was a close confidant of hers but lived in Sydney for a number of years. And then she had her daughters who lived close by. There was Prue, Emma and Sally, and then Matthew was the youngest.
And what kind of childhood did she create for her kids? Did they live this kind of wealthy, privileged lifestyle as well?
They did. They went to expensive schools. The girls went to the same school as their mother, which was Loretto Mandeville Hall in Toorak, and Matthew went to Caulfield Grammar. They had the holidays in their family properties. They had many overseas adventures as a family. When the children were little, they went to Brampton Island, and that's where Margaret met Paul, who became a friend of the family, and eventually she left her husband Brian for Paul, and he became the stepfather to the 5 children.
How did her kids feel about him and what was happening there?
Well, Damien was sort of less affected because he was the eldest, but Matthew said to the police that he had an anger against Paul because he'd broken up his mother and father's relationship. But when Paul was alive, Paul was very much a father figure to Matthew, and some commentators said that the Wales-Kings, that's Margaret and Paul, acted as if Matthew was their son rather than her son with her first husband, Brian. There were also some allegations that were raised of Paul sexually abusing Matthew, but there wasn't a lot of corroboration from anyone else that knew Paul, and indeed the other siblings didn't. They just thought he was a nice gentleman that was their mother's companion.
How did the older kids feel about Matthew when they were growing up or when he was a child?
Well, the feelings that the other siblings had towards Matthew was key to the whole story, because from their statements to the police, they said things like Matthew was a prick of a kid and he was cunning, and different rules applied to him as the youngest than had to them when they were growing up, and that he could get away with anything. His sisters told police that he'd do cruel things to animals on the farm, and so did Damien. Things like tie a piece of rope around a mouse, put the mouse on the back of a motorbike, and then rode the motorbike until the head came off the body of the mouse.
Oh, that's horrible.
I know. And he'd get flies and impale them. He'd pull wings off insects. Things that in lay terminology you'd say, well, he's surely a psychopath for doing those things. But his siblings did think he was different than them, a mixture of the favourite and also the runt of the litter.
That view of him didn't see Matthew isolated from the family, though, because they all still hung out and went over to each other's houses for dinner, so it didn't put them off so much that they excluded him.
No, and he went on and on about that. He had a really lengthy police interview that went on for hours, and he went on and on about how they don't think he's good and how he was alienated and how he was treated differently from the rest of the family. But the fact that his mother and his stepfather even went there for dinner, and he lived nearby like the sisters did, he wasn't that alienated. I think some of it came from the fact that he'd married an older woman who was a Chilean, and he was at some stage engaged to a blonde woman, young blonder woman, who sort of fit more in the mould of the family. And after he broke up the engagement with her, Margaret kept being friends with that young woman. And so that was another resentment that Matthew had, that she didn't approve of Maritza and she wished that he'd married this other woman that fit into the mould a bit more easily.
Can you give us a bit more context about Maritza and the life that Matthew went on to have as an adult?
Well, Maritza was from a Chilean background. She had a sister and a brother. She had a mother and a father that lived in Kew, and she was older than him, just a couple of years. Matthew was a hairdresser and he had a salon, and she was working in the hairdressing salon, cleaning up and doing the books, I think, the admin, and they fell in love, and he was quickly, according to his siblings, besotted with Maritza. The siblings didn't think much of her. They thought she was two-faced. They thought she was quiet and shy when Margaret and Paul were around, but behind the backs of the parents, she was bitching about the money and how they weren't getting enough of the money that Margaret had.
And they had a son, just one son together.
They did. He was 2 at the time of the murders, and Matthew was at home looking after him because he'd got an injury in his hand from the hairdressing. Maritza was working in a shop in High Street that they'd rented called Maritza's Imports. They'd gone on a buying trip to get clothes, and neither of them had any experience in fashion business or running a shop, and the shop wasn't going too well at the time of the murders.
Let's talk a bit more about money, because that was quite a sensitive subject in the Wales family, wasn't it?
That was the key. In the interview, Matthew said to the police, it's not about the money, but about the leverage that she used with the money over us. So his view was that she used it as a power tool and that she dispensed it or didn't dispense it according to favours. And one of the problems was that just prior to the murder, there was a big family fight about a unit in Surfers Paradise. Margaret had inherited that from her father to give to her children, but she didn't want to release the money. The other sister, Di, wanted to sell the unit, and so the Wales siblings thought, well, good, we'll get some money from the unit. But Margaret said, no, I'm going to keep it stitched up and you're not going to get access to that money until after I die. So there was a big dispute in the lawyer's office, and Matthew was pretty upset about that or angry about that because he, of all the siblings, he had the least amount of money.
Apart from Matthew's kind of gripes about the money, did the other siblings have the same feelings? Did they feel like they were being controlled or having money withheld, that kind of thing?
They didn't really talk about it. I think after losing their mother, they didn't want to say anything negative about her, or they just focused on the good points. And they said that she was a loving mother and grandmother. A couple of the in-laws, the son-in-laws, said that she was very manipulative about the money and used it. But by and large, the girls put on a positive face and deeply cared for their mother and didn't want to criticise her in front of the public.
And away from their mother's money, they were doing quite well financially, weren't they? It was mainly Matthew that was struggling.
Exactly right. They were doing well. They had careers of their own, or they had married people that were property investors and bankers, and they had nice houses in good suburbs, and children were going to private schools, and they weren't struggling. The most struggling was Matthew and Maritza, because they'd bought this business and they were living beyond their means.
For some context, as we head into the 2000s, Paul had become quite unwell, and the couple had been dealing with quite a lot, hadn't they, before their disappearance?
Oh, they had, their whole relationship dynamic had shifted. Friends said that he was a doting husband and he did everything for her and looked after her and totally adored her, and she barely had to lift a finger. But with Paul having a few strokes and starting to have dementia because of them, he at 74 was getting quite incapacitated. He could still walk, he could talk, but he went off to a daycare centre for a day's respite a week. And so the dynamic of the marriage changed. And Margaret, who was quite pampered, had to turn into a carer for her husband, and that was a bit of a shock for her.
Can you take us to Thursday, April 4, 2002? What had Margaret and Paul been up to that day?
Well, they lived in a home in Armidale that was like a well-oiled machine. It had a lot of staff or people that they employed to come and help with things. So they had the gardener there, they had someone there to fix the security door, they had the cleaner, and then they had some friends over for a drink, a nice white wine and a bowl of pretzels before they headed off for dinner at their son's house. So it was a very typical day for them in terms of utilising other people to do jobs around the home, interacting with people. Margaret was very social, and then going off to see a family member for dinner.
So that family member was Matthew. They arrived at his house at about 6:45 p.m. Charlie, can you tell us what happened that night?
Unbeknownst to them, he'd already hatched a plan to kill Margaret and clearly Paul. So somewhere along the line leading up to inviting them for dinner on that night on the 4th of April, he'd obviously concocted a way he was going to kill them. So prior to them arriving, he secreted a piece of wood outside in the front garden. He also crushed up some blood pressure tablets that he then put into their soup, no doubt trying to make them drowsy. Laced that with a good swag of wines that would have been consumed on the evening. So that was the plan at that stage, that he would then strike once they were leaving the house, and that's what in fact he did. He was seeing them off, and Maritza was then tending to the child, to the young son, upstairs. And as they were leaving and he was seeing them off to the car, he was able to retrieve the secreted piece of timber he had in the garden and struck them both to the back of the head, rendering them unconscious. He then believed, I take it, that he'd killed them. Their whole system was down anyway because of the alcohol, the drugs, and then being struck to the back of their bludgeoned. They collapsed onto the front lawn of the house. He had a high fence, and then in doing that, he then went into the he dragged them actually onto the lawn. It is at that stage that Maritza looked out the window upstairs and saw him dragging the two bodies onto the lawn. He then went into the garage and retrieved a pool liner. So he had a small swimming pool liner that he had in the garage. He brought that out and placed it over the two bodies. And that's as far as it went, because basically he never planned how then to dispose of the bodies. What do I do now? And that was the irony about it all, is saying, well, I've gone that far. I think he was so obsessed about the killing, he had no idea how he was going to get rid of them. If he didn't have an idea, he didn't plan it that well.
Because he left them there, didn't he, for a few days?
No, he left them there. Now, realistically, the cause of death was asphyxiation. They were unconscious, so they basically suffocated under that pool liner, and that was the basically cause of death was asphyxiation, coupled with the injury to the head, the fact the immune system was compromised with the alcohol and the drugs. So all these combinations, but in actual fact, the cause of death was asphyxiation, given the fact they're covered by a plastic liner, and left them there for a couple of days until he sorted out, well, how am I going to get rid of the bodies? The planning was initially to take them to a particular dam in that particular area, but because it was the water supply of Melbourne, it was all fenced off and he couldn't gain access.
So he didn't really think that through.
Exactly. That was his first method of disposing of the bodies, found it was locked, couldn't do anything about it. He then would, over the ensuing days, he went to Bunnings, purchased a crowbar, happened to be a blue crowbar, that'll come important later on, some rope, some chains, and he did in fact purchase some Besser bricks, because initially taking them to the dam or the water where the reservoir was, he was going to weigh them down with the Besser bricks, but that went to the side because he couldn't get into the dam. So he then had to locate a location to see where he can bury the bodies, and he had a shovel. So all this stuff he purchased on his bank card or one of his credit cards. So for us as investigators, that then creates the audit trail right through. Now, once he's rendered them unconscious and left them, he had to then get rid of their motor car, Mercedes-Benz coupe. So that's a little bit grey at this area, whether he caught a taxi back, but he then drives that to Middle Park near South Melbourne and dumps the Mercedes there and then drives back, because his cover story was going to be, well, I saw them off and they just left. I didn't know what happened after that. And on would life go. He dumped that, got himself back, and I take it was by taxi, because initially we thought Maritza might have followed him, picked him up and brought him back. But she was oblivious of what was going on, and we're pretty confident that she had no idea what was planned by Matthew, her husband.
So Matthew carried out disposal of the bodies by himself. You mentioned he tried to go to the dam. That didn't work. Where did he end up taking the bodies?
What he ended up then doing is hiring a trailer, a box trailer, which he didn't have, loading the bodies into that and started heading towards the bush. And he ended up at a place called Marysville. And unbeknownst to Matthew at that stage, there was a witness that actually saw him drive into that location. I think he was driving a red four-wheel drive at that stage, or a red vehicle of sorts. And because it was late at night, he had no idea where he was going. And he happened to see a dirt track off the main road in the Marysville area. But unbeknownst to him, that dirt track was only a short distance off the main road, and it did a U-turn on itself and come out the other way. So it was like a horseshoe bent road. And you would imagine, middle of the night, the bush is quiet, it's isolated. He would have thought, well, no one's going to find him here. Drove into this particular location, found a suitable place just off the road. It was covered by bushland, and then started digging their grave. It was that difficult in digging them. He could only dig them as deep as the width of two bodies, the torso. If you imagine two torsos, two bodies on top of each other, that's as deep as he could go. And then he backfilled the soil, and in backfilling it, it became a mound. So you've got this flat soil everywhere, but this mound all of a sudden, and you can see it's freshly soiled. As it goes on, there's park rangers that patrol the bush, and they know the bush like the back of their hands. So some days later, these park rangers noticed this big mound of soil. They initially thought it was a lyrebird nest. So they examined it closely and they poked around a little bit, and then they come across some material. And then they certainly believed that there was bodies buried there, or a body buried there. That's where I then start my involvement in the investigation. I was the on-call homicide team. So we were called out to a grave site in the Marysville area. We'd left Melbourne. We went to the scene and we scratched around. We took a forensic team with us, and the forensic team started to move the soil. And what they come across was doona or a sheet of sorts. So what Matthew had done is wrapped up the two bodies in the doona or sheets and put them in the back of the trailer and take them out there. So once we come across that, the forensic people were able to expose a hand of Margaret. And then it was clear to us there was two bodies in the gravesite without disturbing it too much. And that's when we immediately thought these could be the Wales-King couple that had been missing for those previous days.
So that's how their bodies were eventually found. But when was the alarm raised that Margaret and Paul were even missing?
It was quite quickly. It was over the weekend. Three of the daughters thought it was strange that their mother hadn't rung them, but they sort of let it go. They thought maybe she'd gone down to property or left her phone behind or something. So there was a little tinkle of suspicion. And then on Monday morning, the Monday after the Thursday, a woman was trying to contact Margaret about a dog. She just lost her dog. And this woman was quite a busy, efficient sort of woman. And she kept ringing Margaret and then thought something was up because she had an appointment with Margaret on a Monday morning to talk about a new puppy. So she got concerned, and then the daughters got concerned, and they were all ringing each other saying, "Have you heard from Mum?" And then they compared notes and nobody had heard from her, and so then they went to the police.
Margaret's children did end up going over to the house as well and having a look. They had a spare key. Did anything about the state of the house worry them?
Yeah, Margaret was a very fussy woman, according to her children, very house-proud, which is why there were people at the house fixing it up if anything went remotely wrong. And what they found at the house, which is a beautiful townhouse with thick carpets and lovely appliances, was the bedside lamp was on next to the bed. Their mother had turned on the lamp, pulled down the bed, ready to get in when she came home. And she liked things just so, was what they said. And nobody had turned the light off. No one had slept in that bed. So that was of great concern. The second thing of concern was that on the bench was the bowl where the pretzels had been in, there were the wine glasses. So that, in Margaret's terms, was a bit of a mess. And that surprised the children too, because she wouldn't have left the remnants of Thursday night. That wouldn't be like that on Monday if their mother was home.
So they were immediately worried.
Immediately worried. And the last thing was that the driver's licence of Paul, his wallet, his overnight bag, their mother's glasses that she used during the day were all in the normal places in the bedroom, in the wardrobe. So if she'd gone away for the weekend with Paul, she would have had to take her glasses to drive, and she didn't. She didn't take her mobile charger either. So for such a particular woman, this was a signal that something had gone wrong.
How quickly did it go from being a missing persons case to a suspected murder?
Within a matter of days, because one of the big keys was that none of the money, and Margaret had a lot of money in the bank, none of the bank accounts had been touched. There'd been no transactions, say, to get petrol if you're going interstate or on a driving trip. None had been touched. So the bank accounts were absolutely as they were and hadn't been touched. And there were no mobile phone records either after Thursday. So those two things are very key. Everybody uses their phone, more so now, but even then, and everyone withdraws that money from the bank if you're going away. So, or make a transaction with your card. And those things had not happened. So within a matter of days, it quickly changed from a missing persons case to a homicide case.
And how quickly did Matthew become someone of interest in that?
More quickly than you'd know if you were watching it by reading the paper or watching the news, because Damien had a feeling at the very beginning that his little brother had something to do with it, and he told the police that, and he sent the police around to do a welfare check, quote unquote, of Matthew's house, I think about 4 days after they disappeared. And Matthew was acting very weirdly. Everybody else was crying and upset. And then the kids all gathered in the house to have a meeting, really, to say, where could Mum be? Let's try these friends, or let's try this property. And Matthew came late. He wasn't there at first. Then he came late. And then he walked in and he did a big display of emotion. And he was holding his head in his hands and he was crying, "Where's my mama? Where's my mama?" like a baby. And they were all onto him as to the weirdness of his reaction, but especially Damien.
You mentioned people following it in the papers and through TV reports. This case was very highly publicised at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. It's hard to imagine now, but it was one of the first murders in Melbourne where there was, I suppose, a nickname for it. And the fact that the missing people were very rich gave people interest. It wasn't, say, a gangland murder. It was like, why would these rich, lucky people go missing and what's going on? So there was a sense of schadenfreude straight away, and I think that fed the media frenzy.
And police used that, high level of public interest to their advantage in their investigations, didn't they?
Yes, they did a media interview, and some of the siblings gave a plea to the public if you found anything. And the first thing that came out of that was the big silver Mercedes, which was parked in Middle Park. And that was noticed by a solicitor who lived nearby, and it didn't have the local parking sticker on it and was there for a few days outside a house that was being built. So he, after watching the media release, contacted the police. So that was the first big clue, was the car was parked there. They looked through the car. They thought they'd open the boot and they thought they might find the bodies, but that wasn't the case. But that was another level of strange behaviour, because Margaret wouldn't have left her car there and gone off. If she'd gone away driving with Paul, they would have stayed in the car.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Melbourne barrister Hilary Bonney and former detective Charlie Bezzina about the Society murders. So we have some pieces of evidence, some suspicions from the family, and by this stage, the bodies that you mentioned earlier, Charlie, have been found. Where does your investigation go from here?
We get the bodies back to the coroner's court. We start doing the postmortems, and then we find the injuries to their skulls. We then possibly identify them as the Wales-King couple, but that then show us who did it. We started gathering this evidence. You don't know what the evidence is going to show, so you gather all the evidence at the crime scene. And once we had excavated, what we saw, and there was this particular photograph of myself looking down the gravesite, and there's blue striations of paint on the sides of the gravesite. Now, we were later to find that came from the crowbar that he purchased. So we were able then to, or missing persons were able then to get the details of his credit card, what purchases have been made. They could link the doona and the sheet back to the house at Wales-King, so there's a link. Then finding out what he purchased from Bunnings, the grey-stone blocks, the chain, the locks, the rope and lights, which matched what was found at the crime scene. And then the crowbar. So we went back to Bunnings. We saw the crowbar was blue. We got the blue striation. So that gives you a direct link between the deceased, the crime scene at Marysville, and the offender, Matthew. Good start, but again, you've still got to prove it. So the issue then became, because of the significant media attention based on Matthew, how were we going to conduct an arrest without causing all and sundry to become, make it a circus? That's what we didn't want to do.
So all of those bits that you had collected and pieced together already, that gave you enough to arrest him?
It gave us enough, what we call reasonable cause, that gave us the authority, or certainly the power, to arrest him. It's all methodical. Every investigation is methodical. And then we build up on the evidence. There wasn't a threat. We knew that he wasn't going to kill anybody else. So the clock wasn't on, but we had to find that opportunity to, when do we make the arrest? What evidence have we got? Because you work on the premise a lot of the times that a person's going to say no comment. Had Matthew said, I don't know what you're talking about, there still would have been enough evidence to tie him up to his credit card, to what he purchased, to what was found at the gravesite. It all tied in nicely, and he had nowhere to go. So regardless of not assisting us, he would have been charged anyway.
How did Matthew react when he was arrested?
Matthew reacted quite calmly, and I think he knew it's a matter of time. Because when he was arrested, I know that he said to the investigators, I didn't do it for her money. I just hated her.
So he admitted it straight up?
Yeah, pretty much, because he was waiting for it. He knew that, he'd disposed of the body quite hurriedly, that I think he would have considered, what have I done? There'd been searches on his home, and he knew he was a potential suspect, and especially what his siblings were saying. So he knew it was a matter of time. And with jobs like that, it becomes a matter of relief. When police come, okay, I can stop worrying now. And as bizarre as it sounds, you're waiting for, the guillotine to drop. and all of a sudden it drops. And that when the police, that's the guillotine. Right. I didn't kill her for her money. I just hated her that much. So he wanted to make that clear from the get-go. So he was brought back, and he was cooperative from that point onwards. Then we were left with the situation with Maritza. Now, there's constraints about spouses giving evidence against each other. He didn't have a lawyer present, but Maritza saw a lawyer, a QC, or now a KC, King's Counsel, is Phil Dunn, a very accomplished, significant defence lawyer. So he was representing Maritza because we were going to charge Maritza with pervert the course of justice because she gave us a false statement. Because at that stage, we still believe that she played a significant role in the disposal, maybe not so much the murder, but certainly the disposal of the bodies. But as it then turned out, I can remember sitting in the interview room or a meeting room with Phil Dunn and ourselves, and Phil Dunn asked us whether we could guarantee him that his client, and it was all hypothetical. And hypothetically, if my client were to say that she only saw her husband out the window, and hypothetically this and hypothetically that, can you guarantee she won't go to jail? Well, we can't. We can't even suggest that.
Because there is such a thing as giving immunity, or if you plead guilty, you get a shorter sentence. Was there a pathway in any of that for her?
Well, we didn't have to go down that path because we had significant evidence to charge Matthew, so we didn't really need her evidence. But if we really needed her evidence to support our case, yes, we would have then gone to the DPP and say, will you give this lady immunity to give evidence against her husband?
Is my timeline correct in that she actually went to the defence barrister before Matthew was arrested?
Yeah.
So she was trying to get a little bit ahead of the eight ball. She could see what was happening and thought, I've got to kind of save my skin a bit.
She could see the cliff coming and she had her son to worry about. If Matthew gets charged with murder and I get charged, who's going to look after our son? So she was motivated, not more by Matthew, more motivated by her child. And that's what preempted her to go and see a lawyer to say, well, I've lied to the police. They're going to charge me. I'm going to go to jail. What can we do? And then you sit down there as investigators and say, well, Phil, we can't give that, but it certainly looked very favourably. Never been in trouble with the police before. She's got a young child to look after. We're going to be charging the father with a double murder. So subsequently, she got charged with a pervert the course of justice rather than not charge her at all. We were obliged to charge her, and she's got a 2-year suspended sentence, which was the best result out because ultimately she could then go on with her life. She's accounted for the fact that she was an accessory basically after the fact of seeing Matthew, and she should have alerted the authorities then, but she didn't. But torn between the wrong thing to do and supporting her husband. I can see her predicament as a wife, as a spouse.
For listeners, can you explain what an apprehended sentence means, what that means for the person? They don't actually go to prison initially unless they do something wrong.
Exactly. She was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. What they do is then suspend that. It's like giving a good behaviour bond. The 2 years is suspended over your head, and if you commit any crime in that 2-year period, you will then be brought back to the court and then you'll undergo that 2-year sentence imprisonment that you've been sentenced to. This is just giving a licence to go out, be of good behaviour for 2 years, and then this will all go away. So she went on with her life.
Looking at the media coverage of the time, even though you guys, could see that empathetic side that all she did in this scenario was lie to police, she wasn't actually involved in removing the bodies or murder or anything, but she did get slammed in the media. She was getting absolutely torn apart.
I think because she came across as a little bit hard.
Right.
I think just from appearance and as you know, the public had followed the case so closely and all these armchair detectives, well, how could she not be involved? She was there on the night. How could she not know? How could she not this? And they start becoming all these summations, but you've got to know the evidence in the case. And but no, I think the public, I agree with what you're saying, they took a very harsh look towards Maritza and said, no, she's conned the coppers. She had a full involvement, but that's all good and well, but we know the facts. And the facts don't support what you're saying against Maritza. She was an innocent agent in supporting her husband. And what would you do if you found yourself in that same position? But that was only harsh commentary from the public to target Maritza because that's how she came across publicly.
When it comes to someone like Matthew, who hasn't committed a crime before and then goes and commits a double homicide and then confesses to everything, how does the legal system look at a case like that? Does it look favourably upon someone for confessing?
Well, yes and no, because here's a guy, never been in trouble with the police before. It wasn't like it was an underworld hit. It was more emotionally driven, but he's actually planned it. So it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It wasn't as if they got in an argument after dinner and he hit them and they fell and hit their head. The fact that he planned it certainly went badly towards him because he'd planned it, but the ignorance of how he's going to get rid of the bodies, the fact of any further planning after that, just showed that he was more emotionally driven rather than criminally driven. To say, well, I just wanted to kill her, I hated her that much. I've got the bodies now, what am I going to do now? And then stupidity then plays in and say, mate, you're not a criminal per se, you're not a seasoned criminal, but you're driven by emotions. We can understand what emotions play and motive, what motivates killings within a family unit. Money motivated, he denied that, never wanted anything from her, but the way she treated him, I hated her that much. That hate kept on coming out. And so that mitigated it to a small degree. But the planning then sort of brings it back up again to say, well, no, you premeditated this. You could have walked away and you didn't. You didn't have to be with your mother. You could have then moved somewhere else. You had all these alternatives, but you know what? You saw your only way out is to kill your mother and your stepfather. And to that end, he then got the 30 years, which was a pretty decent sentence in those days.
Did he show any remorse throughout any of that process?
Yeah, well, he did. Whether it was remorse for the killings, I don't think, but probably remorse of being caught and being so stupid. I think that's where remorse was, but I don't think there was any remorse for his mother. Such was his hate towards her.
How did the rest of his siblings react to his sentence, to him being charged, to what he did?
No surprise. They were it was only a matter of time. They'd already concluded that Matthew had played a role in that, and that was further fueled by the fact, well, hang on, so they go to your place for dinner, and then not heard of or seen off after that, come on. And then their suspicions were there from the early stages. And come the arrest, it was more of a relief to say, finally you've arrested him. We've been telling you that all this time. Yeah, but we've got to get our case together so the case can stick. And you never know what they're going to say once you make the arrest. So you've really got to get your ducks in a row and be confident, even if he says no comment, that you've got enough to charge him.
During the court proceedings, Matthew was tested by a psychologist. What did they find?
He said that he was very immature and that he was not a very regulated person, and that was some concerns. He felt like he'd been bullied. He felt like he'd been alienated from his family and that he wasn't accepted. And he went on and on about going to someone's house, one of his sister's house, and there were all the photos of the family on the sideboard, but no photo of him. So he really felt marked out as different from the rest of his siblings. And that was a consistent theme throughout the psychological assessment.
Was he diagnosed with anything during that process?
No, not with a psychiatric disorder, but it was found that he had a very, very low IQ, almost intellectually disabled. I think it was around about 83, which is quite low functioning. And what I thought was that because he had been landed in this family with resources and the dialogue and the discourse of the educated, he didn't appear quite as simple as he was.
We mentioned before Matthew's sentence, and he's actually due for parole in 2026, which is coming up quite quickly. He'll be 58. His son will be 26. Obviously, letting people out of prison is part of the system. Charlie, how do you feel about letting someone like Matthew back out on the streets?
Well, I've got no issues with Matthew being given parole. The fact is, it was within a family unit. Whether he can pick up the pieces with his son or whether his son has been visiting him in jail, I don't know, or Maritza. Even if he comes out, look, I've got no qualms at all because I can't see where Matthew will re-offend again, not certainly to this degree. He served his time in jail over a killing of his mother, which he'll never have again. But what does he do with his life? time will tell.
Finally, I'd love to ask you both, is there anything that stays with you from this crime?
Look, I suppose as a homicide investigator, and what you never get surprised in seeing is it just reinforces the potential every human being has got to be able to kill. People say to me, what makes a killer? Well, we're all killers in ourselves, but we know right from wrong and what we're going to do, and we can reason with it. But when something like Matthew, it just manifests itself so much that his only way out is to actually kill someone to remove them from his life, it's not out of the norm, like a serial killer or the likes. It's just one of those things, you know what, this has been driven by hate and greed, possibly within a family unit. I can understand that. Call it, one of a better word, a domestic murder as opposed to an underworld murder. So at the end of the day, nothing really sticks with you, just the way of the stupidity of Matthew, of how we left the trail. You got to follow in the bleeding elephant in the snow. So made our job a lot easier, but just goes to show that you don't have to be smart to kill people, just have a hatred to do that or a reason to do that, and he certainly did have that.
And Hilary, you've written a book about this case. What was it that drew you to this, and what stuck with you?
What interested me about the case was the unusual type of people that have disappeared. It's not usually wealthy people with lucky lives that go missing. It's usually people that aren't going well in life. And I think also the other fact that I think that other people were interested as well that I picked up on was that they were so wealthy and so affluent. And it's, why would they go missing? What would go wrong? A lot of people think if you've got a lot of money that you're lucky and everything's happy in your life. And I think what the public liked or interested or fascinated about by this murder was it didn't matter how much money you had. There were other things that make you happy. So money can't buy you happiness. And that the more this family had, the sort of worse it got from Matthew's point of view. So I think that's what intrigued people. They're also a very handsome family, very good looking. They represented to Melbourne society what people strive for in Melbourne, the good schools, good family, good house, good suburbs. So there was a degree of aspirational interest about this. These people had everything and look where it got them. Then maybe I'm not so bad after all in my not as good house. And so I think that was the attraction. And it was the first sort of murder like that we'd had when there was media and when there were journalism. I mean, there have been murders like that back at the turn of the century, but this was the first one that sparked that imagination and that interest in the public. There was a docu-series about this murder and another one like it, and it was called Behind the Mansion Walls. And it's a cheesy title, but I think it kind of sums up the fascination of pulling back the curtain and looking at, oh, they've got everything, but no, they don't. And so I think there's a degree of schadenfreude about this story that attracted attention.
And like you say, showing people that, money doesn't buy happiness.
No, money doesn't buy happiness. And in some ways, the more you have, the more dramas you have and the more fighting over it and the more problems you have about distributing the wealth. And that competition and that jealousy was what fueled Matthew to kill his mother.
Tell me about matricide, killing your own mother. How common is that in Australia?
Well, it's not very common, and some people think it's the last taboo to kill the person that gave you life. And it does seem to be more shocking than perhaps killing another family member. In Australia at the time of this murder, there are about 340 murders a year, and 12 of these were parents killed by their children, often by schizophrenic children, and 5 of those were mothers. But it's very rare to somebody who's not, say, paranoid schizophrenic or suffering from drug-induced psychosis to actually kill their mother.
Thanks to Charlie and Hilary for assisting us to tell this story. If you'd like to read more about the case, you can find a link for Hilary's book, The Society Murders, in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Rhiannon Mooney. The executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. It helps other true crime fans find our content and helps us keep making the episodes you get to enjoy every week. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.